Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lilia Ramjawan, and I am the program coordinator for the SDG Fund Joint Program on Universal Adaptive Social Protection in the Eastern Caribbean. And I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar will be recorded, so we will just ask you to take note of that. So today's webinar is designed to reinforce the capacities of participants in unemployment protection schemes, focusing on the critical aspects of design, financing, and implementation. This webinar is part of a series of knowledge and sharing sessions organized by the Joint SDG Fund on Social Protection in the Eastern Caribbean. And it is to provide Caribbean countries with the opportunity to share experiences and lessons learned in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and how their social protection systems are being strengthened to better able to respond. So before I take you to our panel of distinguished experts, let me just tell you a little bit about the joint program. And if I could share the screen, that would be good. Thank you. Right. So the joint program is the first of its kind in the Eastern Caribbean. It supports government-led efforts to reduce poverty and inequality and strengthens people's resilience through predictable access to universal adaptive social protection. The joint program is being implemented in Barbados, St. Lucia, and the wider OECS through the OECS Commission. The program is a collaboration between 5 UN agencies, and you will see them on the screen here. The World Food Program, UNICEF, UNDP, ILO, which is sponsoring the webinar today, and UN Women. So how is the joint program contributing to universal adaptive social protection? Well, by strengthening capacities at both the national and community and individual levels. So at the national level, the joint program is supporting countries in improving their institutional capacities for a more integrated service delivery by providing evidence-based and gender-responsive policy reviews and assessments. And that is to inform governments in the shock-responsive management policies. At the community and individual levels, by piloting shock-responsive social protections, we are supporting vulnerable populations by providing them with increased access. And of course, we're ensuring that it is gender sensitive and risk informed. So in this way, governments will better be able to access the needs of the population and use social protection to minimize the impact of shocks on vulnerable persons. Of course, none of this is sustainable in the long run without adequate financing. So the joint program will also recommend innovative financing strategies to ensure fiscal sustainability and expand coverage. So it is the intention that the mechanism that is being piloted under the joint program to help countries strengthen their social protection system can be rolled out in other Caribbean countries. And that is why we are strengthening the capacity at the OECS level in order to do so. So while the initial intention of the joint program was to help countries prepare for future shocks, current events have evidently overtaken us. So the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in major social and economic dislocation throughout the Caribbean, and that resulted in a sharp increase in employment levels. Barbados and St. Lucia, like other regional governments, adopted a range of measures to support the most vulnerable, including providing support to unemployment persons. So we will hear from them today. We will also hear from an expert from the ILO on the critical importance that well-designed unemployment schemes play in stabilizing the economy after shocks. So without further ado, we'll hear our speakers today. First, we have Mr. Ariel Pino. Mr. Pino is the Social Protection and Occupational Safety and Health Specialist of the Decent Work Team and the Office for the Caribbean. Mr. Pino's role is to assist governments, employers, and workers' organizations of the ILO Caribbean member states and territories in order to strengthen their social protection systems and occupational safety and health policies and practices. He previously worked in social security as a social security specialist at the ILO Office for West Africa, based in Senegal. And he also worked for the International Society Social Security Association as a regional coordinator for the Americas and the Africas. He's from Argentina, and he has worked 8 years as senior advisor as the Secretariat for Social Security at the Ministry of Labor in Argentina. Mr. Pino has been working in the area of social protection for the past 24 years. So we are happy to have him, and we know that we will benefit from his expertise. Next, we have Mrs. Suwan Shari Payne. Mrs. Payne is the Group Financial Controller for the National Insurance Corporation in St. Lucia, and she spearheads the implementation of the Economic Relief Program approved by the National Insurance Corporation in response to the hardships brought about by COVID-19. So she previously served as an audit professional for over 17 years as head of group internal audit for the group and for the NIS group, and prior in external auditing with PricewaterhouseCoopers and Grant Thornton. We're happy to have Mrs. Shari with us as well. Moving on, we have Mr. Paul Kalicharan. Mr. Kalicharan is the statistician, that's a mouthful, for the National Insurance Corporation with responsibility for the Statistics and Research Department. Prior to implementation of the Economic Relief Program, Mr. Kalicharan provided the corporation with projected impact of COVID-19 on active insured persons and its related financial implications for the fund. Welcome, Mr. Kalicharan. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Mr. Derek Lowe, who is the Acting Assistant Director with responsibility for customer relations at the National Insurance Department in Barbados. As director, Mr. Lowe is responsible for coordination and management of the customer relations section while providing efficient level of service at both internal and external customers. So Mr. Lowe would be responsible for formulation of appropriate systems and procedures for customer relations in accordance with policy guidelines approved by management. So that would include review and update of existing procedures, as well as the development of new systems and procedures. Welcome, Mr. Lowe. So before I hand you to our eminent panel, I would remind you that to share your questions to the speakers, you can do that through the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. But at the end of the sessions, we will also have set time for question and answer. So thank you. And first, let me call on Mr. Ariel Pino to start us off.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Good day to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. So I will show my presentation now. Yeah, great. Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Lydia. Good day to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all today in this event talking about unemployment insurance. So I will bring the ILO perspective on employment insurance with some practical experiences from other countries, but not too much of that, because we have the colleagues from St. Lucia and Barbados who will also provide some experiences from the Caribbean. So presentation will be focused on an introduction, setting the stage for the unemployment insurance, and then we'll talk about policy and design matters of unemployment insurance schemes. So, I wanted to start by reminding everyone about what does it fit when we talk about unemployment insurance. And certainly fits in a collective effort in achieving universal social protection that is comprehensive, adequate, sustainable, and responsive. So one of the key elements that we used to do that is the social protection floor, providing security income throughout the life cycles. Particularly in the case we are talking today, those without jobs or those who are actively searching for a job. We will see that a bit later. As a social and economic necessity, I wanted to reinforce here that the pandemic actually made evident that we all need social protection. It's not just for the poor and vulnerable. And when we see the number of benefits that social security institutions have implemented in a very short period of time to protect livelihoods of workers who were affected by the pandemic in the labor market, so we'll see how important it is to consider the universality and the comprehensiveness of social protection systems. And certainly the unemployment protection schemes come in here. There is a wide range of mechanisms that we can use when we are attempting to provide progressively universal social protection. And here is, you have here a panorama of the different mechanisms that we can use in cash or in kind. And also I highlighted particularly those who are related to unemployment, such as unemployment assistance, unemployment insurance, what we typically know and see when we talk about unemployment insurance, but we will see throughout the presentation that there is much more than that. And it also relates to enhancing the capacities of the unemployed to reinsert, or at least to remain in the labor market. Despite of all these efforts and agreements, so we still see that when it comes to unemployment, only 22% of the unemployed are covered by insurance schemes, right? And we will have by the end of the year updated statistics with the publication of the World Social Protection Report. But as we did some research last year, so the pandemic is expected to have impacted about 60% of jobs in terms of reduction of employment and an increase in poverty. And also important, keep in mind this 20% of reduction of working hours, because it's something that we can certainly address also through unemployment protection schemes. And particularly for the Caribbean, because of the pandemic and restrictions in travel, so the hospitality sector was very affected. Therefore, a lot of jobs from that sector were lost in the Caribbean. We collected some data from social security institutions, Belize, Turks and Caicos Islands, and Antigua and Barbuda. And you will see in this chart, what you see is the number of employees by size of enterprise. Now, in the x-axis, you have 1, 2, 3, depending on the number of employees. And then the lines are telling you how these were affected by month compared with the previous years. And you see that, for the example of Belize, April was the worst month of the last years in terms of the reduction in number of active employees. That may be because they are not paying contributions, or most probably because they lost jobs. So here you have magnitude of, you have an unemployment insurance in Belize, how this could have been affected. The same thing, quite similar for Turks and Caicos Islands, and the same thing for Antigua and Barbuda. Much more important, this effect was in the self-employed, whereas you can see by June last year, so in some countries, so you can see that almost 80% of the self-employed compared with the previous years were not anymore paying contributions. So to address these problems in the labor market, certainly the social security institutions were the first respondents, right? Because they provided income support to the unemployed, and they did that through social security reserves or through government funds, sometimes to workers who lost jobs and were affiliated to social security, and sometimes to those who were not affiliated to social security in the informal sector or the self-employed. And in that case, they were also provided with some livelihood. But also there were some for poor and vulnerable groups, in kind and in cash benefits were also distributed. And social security had to adapt quickly to work in an environment which is fully online, crafted by the physical distancing. Therefore, governance structures were rapidly adapted. And in some cases, the unemployed were provided with online training to enhance the skills and the employability. Here is some data that we collected last year in terms of the number of benefits that these temporary and emergency unemployment protection mechanisms were paid. So except in Barbados and the Bahamas, where the unemployment insurance exists, in all other jurisdictions, and you can see here, so some sort of relief was provided through Social Security or through other departments of the government. But if you put all together, more than 200,000 benefits were actually paid to the unemployed in the Caribbean. Some usually took the form of periodic payments throughout 3 months. That was extended, and now in some countries, like here, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, the salary relief grant was revived, and there is a new wave of payment that is coming now because of the second wave of the pandemic here. So in terms of policy matters, so what do we want to protect when we're talking about unemployment insurance schemes? And we know, as we just saw, that in terms of crisis, there is a reduction in working hours, but there is also a temporary permanence of lost jobs. And we have sectors or segments of the labor market that are certainly more at risk. And that certainly is the self-employed, because where they are covered by Social Security, the coverage is very low. And in most of the cases, the unemployment insurance does not protect the self-employed. The workers in the informal economy, as we know, with a very gender dimension there, very important gender dimension. And then, of course, the non-standard forms of employment that for the moment they are not duly covered by Social Security. So what we want to, in that context, what do unemployment insurance schemes try to protect? The contingency cover, as this is explained by the Convention 102 or the ILO, is the suspension of earnings. And this is defined by law, how determination of benefits, termination of employment is managed. The loss of earnings should be due to the inability to obtain sustainable employment in the case of a person protected who is capable of and available for work. This is very important, that be capable and available for work. And we will see then how, a bit more explicitly, how this could be done. I said keep in mind the reduction of working hours, because social employment insurance changed over time, evolved over time. And since the beginning, it was mainly focused to compensate for the job loss. So the employment relationship is broken, you qualify for the unemployment insurance, therefore you are compensated. And of course, you have to be capable and actively searching for a job, for a full-time, sometimes part-time jobs too. But the evolution of the unemployment insurance schemes made a relationship with the labor market. And that promoted also the keeping the employment relationship alive, because we know how costly and how difficult it is to, first of all, terminate an employment relationship, and second, engage in a new employment relationship. And this is not just for the employee, but also for the government and also for the employment. So the model unemployment insurance schemes, unemployment protection schemes are actually not just only compensated, but also include a component that preserves the employment relationship. And also it has linkages with the labor market, because it promotes employability. So people are better prepared to engage and find jobs. So here you have a schematic view of what I just said before. You have a construction of employment and social protection policies. In terms of the unemployment protection, either you prevent the breaking the employment relationship, and here you can use partial employment retention benefits, or if there is a suspension or temporary suspension of the employment relationship, you can engage the unemployment insurance schemes. And then if the employment relationship is broken, okay, so you have the typical in cash benefit provided by the unemployment insurance. There are also, from the linkages with the active labor market policies, the opportunity for those who are affected to receive employment services, such as job matching, for example, vocational training, entrepreneurship, and other active labor market policies that can certainly help the unemployed to re-engage in the labor market. Also, in some countries, you can find public employment programs which can help during times of unemployment to access to jobs, decent jobs. And in some countries, like in India, you have the unemployment guarantee scheme, which actually is guaranteeing 100 days of work to poor and vulnerable households through a decentralized mechanism with the local governments. So in terms of the design, there are some benchmarks in the international labor standards. And this is certainly the Convention 102 of the ILO, as well as the Convention 168, the Employment Promotion and Protection Against Unemployment Convention. So you have there in the international labor standards a set of benchmarks that address a number of very important things, such as, for example, that the overall responsibility of these schemes should remain with the state. And there should be proper administration of the social security system, social security schemes. Also, the international standards talk about solidarity and collective financing and risk pooling. So we try to, as we have in other branches of social security, the same approach in terms of collective financing and cross subsidies, horizontal and vertical, of social security in place. The participation of the key stakeholders, notably social partners, workers and employers in the management of social security schemes, guarantee of defined benefits, that the benefits, particularly in pensions, should be adjusted to maintain purchasing power, and finally, that they should have, every social protection system, they should have a right to complain and appeal mechanisms. So these recommendations and conventions give that benchmark for developing unemployment insurance schemes. So the key aspects that we find in the conventions is, of course, the qualification rules, and as I said before, is the suspension of earnings due to inability to find suitable employment and are capable or and available for work. Convention 168 also included some suspension refusal, in which cases that the unemployment benefit can be suspended, right? In terms of the duration of benefits, the conventions talk about 13 or 26 weeks in a period of 12 months, or maybe 26 weeks in 24 months. Usually you find 13 or 26 is the norm that you find in different employment schemes. And in terms of the benefit levels, the minimum is 45% of the reference wage, average wage earnings as you calculate in your scheme. And 168, which is provided a higher level of protection, is prescribing 50% of previous earnings. I won't talk about the example of Barbados because Derek will talk about it, but some examples of the Bahamas in terms of these three parameters. So you have to be younger than 65 in the Bahamas and satisfies the Department of Labor conditions, that you are registered with them and you are a job seeker. And then you have to have three conditions of contribution. You have to pay at least 52 contributions, credited with at least 13 contributions in the 26 weeks immediately after, immediately before the week in which you lost jobs, and also credited with at least 7 contributions in 13 weeks. So they're like a triple condition of contributions. Then is a total period of 13 weeks within a 52-week period is the duration of the benefit, meaning that you can receive in the 52-week period 2, 3, 4 payments until you reach 50. And the replacement rate or the benefit level is 50% of average weekly insurable income. And the unemployment benefit is paid weekly when you satisfy the condition of the labor department. In terms of financing, you find typically contributions being paid by workers and the employees, and in some cases there is the government through general revenue contributing to the unemployment scheme. As I said before, the international standards call for collective financing, and that could be done through insurance contributions or taxes, but hardship to workers and employees should be avoided. In some cases, like in Chile, you have a mechanism of individual accounts that are the financing mechanism of unemployment insurance. And an important aspect is that the financial sustainability through actuarial reviews and periodic calculations is always present. Usually you can find as you can see in the table, that the employers pay a bit more than the employees, and in some cases the employees, they don't pay. Also what you see is that in some cases there are other contributions done for the unemployment insurance. You can see in Barbados for the training levy, or for a solidarity fund in Chile, or in France for a wage guarantee schemes. And usually self-employed are voluntary covered, and when they are voluntary covered, they have higher contribution rates. You have in Switzerland, for example, is related to the earnings of the workers, and up to 148 to 203 francs is 1.1% for each. And then on top of that, so you add 1% and there is no cap. So they don't have a maximum earnings considered for contributions, as we can see in some other countries. So as you see, there is a variety of contribution rates, and of course it depends on the particular parameters of the labor market and the social security scheme. In terms of the key parameters, what you usually find is that for coverage, private and public sector workers are included. Also, part-time workers, seasonal workers, and migrant workers are part of the unemployment insurance. Basically the same that are covered under the other branches of social security. Possible exclusions that you find is self-employed, that sometimes they allow for voluntary contributions, but that the problem of asymmetric information and more as that comes up. Voluntary contributors, agricultural workers, and household workers are usually not included. In terms of the sources of fund, as I said before, employee contributions are the most used mechanism. So you also have to consider the minimum and maximum earnings for contributions. And in the case where the government is injecting funds or paying non-contributory schemes, so they do it through general revenue. In terms of the qualifying conditions, you usually have a period of insurance to consider, number of contributions paid. You have to fulfill the qualifications for the termination of employment. Usually, as we said before, voluntary termination of employment is not covered, should be with just cause. There is also a short waiting period before being allowed to claim a benefit. That's 3 days, 7 days. Usually 7 days, usually the waiting period to allow job seekers to find a job before immediately claiming for a benefit, or in some cases to avoid fraud. How the unemployment benefits are coordinated with other type of benefits, severance and redundancy notably. The Labor Department conditions, active search of jobs, job matching. Sometimes in some countries you have to contact the administration every 3 weeks, every 2 weeks, every month, and you have to also accept an offer which suits your profile. Engaging skills is sometimes a condition, skills development or other type of TVET is part of the conditions to keep receiving the unemployment benefits. We talked about the benefit rate, the 45% or the 50%. We also talked about the duration, 13 or 26 weeks. And in some unemployment schemes, you also have entitlements. While you are receiving, unemployment benefits, and this you continue having right to, for example, benefit from maternity benefits or funeral grants, or you consider the period of unemployment benefits as you have had contributions, so therefore you don't lose rights when you come back to job. A very important aspect is how you start the operations of the unemployment insurance schemes, because you have an option which is the wait for a reserve fund created. So you have a period of paying contributions while you don't pay benefits, and then when you have some reserves, you start paying benefits. Or you can transfer reserves from short-term or long-term unemployment injury branches to the unemployment insurance, as it happened in the Bahamas. You can also set up a transition period for the unemployment insurance, or you can probably get initial funding from different sources, from the government, from development assistance, to create a fund and start immediately. But in any case, it is advisable to start with the less costly option, and then assess and evaluate how it goes, and then build on that experience. The linkages with the active labor market programs are key and should be implemented to engage with the effective management of the labor market. The problem in the Caribbean is that only in a few countries you have quite developed active labor market programs, and in the others you don't have much. So it's something that needs to be developed as soon as the unemployment insurance is also being developed. And finally, the coordination with the benefits. In all jurisdictions, we have some sort of redundancy or severance payments, which actually are completely different to the unemployment benefits, because they don't have any linkages with, for example, your previous contributions when it comes in terms of the level of the benefit. They don't require any participation in active labor market policies. So you usually have different objectives. So we need to carefully understand how you put these two benefits together. We will see in Barbados, for example, you have both. You can access both at the same time, but in the Bahamas is different. So first you have to exhaust severance, and then you can get access to the unemployment insurance. So options exist. So I think with that, Lilia, I stop sharing now my screen, and I will remain available to respond to any questions or comments you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel, for taking us through this holistic approach to unemployment insurance and how the different countries can benefit from the implementation. Just as a reminder for the participants, you can now begin adding your questions to the Q&A chat box. So we will now hear from St. Lucia. St. Lucia has basically been piloting unemployment insurance since COVID-19. So we're going to hear from them about the economic relief program. And to do that, I invite Suan and Paul.
Thank you, Lydia.
Yes.
Would you mind sharing the presentation? Okay, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for inviting us to be part of this webinar. We would run through the outline of our presentation. The focus would be, we would start with the origin of the program. Lydia, you can probably move to the next slide, please. Thank you. The origin of the ERP, we would start with that. We would walk through a timeline of the process we went through from design, implementation, the relative legislative amendments we needed to undertake, right through to the payout. We would move on to providing some statistical information on the actual payments that were made under the program. We would indicate what impact that had on the fund. We would speak a little on the government's income support program that we assisted with, a little bit on the lessons learned and the outlook for the future. As it relates to the origin of the program, like most economies, we were not spared the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. In March 2020, we saw the unprecedented loss of livelihood with the closure of businesses across all sectors of our economy, resulting in a number of our employees, our contributors, their families being laid off or made redundant. This moved the NIC to design, develop, and implement the economic relief program to provide some economic relief beyond our normal legislative benefits that we pay. As it relates to the timeline, so we had to implement this program in a relatively short space of time. And again, that benefit was specific to persons who suffered a loss of income as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Lydia, you can move to the next slide, please. So we saw the first case of COVID-19 being confirmed in St. Lucia in March, the 13th of March, 2020. At that time, we already started conceptualizing a program that could possibly benefit our persons as our existing Act, our fund did not cater for that. We saw in the 23rd of March, the government declared a state of emergency, which saw the shutdown of non-essential commercial activity, the closure of countries, airports, and so on. And on March 23rd, that program that we were conceptualizing, and we had sought assistance from our actuaries to provide advice on what impact our projected payout would have on the fund to inform the approval of such a program. We received that feedback on March 23rd, and within a month, we saw the relative necessary legislative amendments being made to allow that program to be implemented and to allow the payout to come out from our existing fund. So the existing fund would finance that program at the time. April 24th, we saw the regulations required for that program. We saw that being enacted. And the initial time frame we had for that program was a 3-month period from April to June 2020. And we saw in quick time after, and we know how much time it normally takes for legislative amendments to happen, but everyone was on board, and we saw a quick turnaround on that. And the hard work of the NIC saw that design being implemented, where within a week, less than a week actually, we were able to accept online applications from our beneficiaries, our contributors, sorry, who qualified to benefit from that program. In order to ensure that the payouts were in accordance with the regulations that were fair, we needed the input from the employers as well. I would speak a little on the next slide about the requirements of the program and so on, but one of the areas that were important to us is to get feedback from the employers. On May 5th, we saw the first submission from the employers on an internally developed employers portal that facilitated the receipt of information online from the employers. On May 11th, less than 2 weeks after, we saw the first batch of payments being made under the ERP. And that continued until the end of June, where we actually realized, again, because the situation was one that was unknown to us, we didn't know how long it was required to implement such a program. We actually extended the program for a further 3 months from July to September, and the relative legislation was passed on June 30th to facilitate that. Next, I will speak on the actual design of our ERP program. So to qualify for that program, a contributor had to have been employed as at February. And you would remember that I mentioned a bit of the timeline, because we saw in March was when there was a shutdown of the country and so on. And because that program was specific to persons who suffered a loss as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, a qualifying contribution requirement of February 2020 was instituted. So for one to have qualified for the program, they had to have been employed as at February. So it gives us some sort of indication that the loss of employment was as a result of COVID-19. Subsequent to that, they had to have suffered, so they had to have contributed once to the fund and had to have been employed as at February. They had to have suffered a termination of their salary during the period of the program, which was April to September. So once they were unemployed during that period, they would have benefited from the program. In the case of self-employed, I mentioned before that we needed the input from the employers to validate the information, as in the person lost the income as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. And so we got the employers to provide that feedback. In the case of self-employed, it was a bit different, where the individual, the contributor, was the employer as well. So the criteria was a little different with them, and also with the way they pay. The way they pay. So they would have paid at least one, they had to have paid at least one contribution within the last 12 months prior to February 29 to have qualified. And again, they had to have been below pensionable age. Persons should not have been in receipt of an existing benefit from the NIC. However, if they were, we would have paid the higher of the two, whether it be the ERP if they qualified or one of our existing benefits. The rate of payment of the ERP, the Economic Relief Program, was designed to be 50% of the insurable earnings of the individual as at February 2020. But there was a minimum threshold set of $500. So if you are making below $1,000, your payout would not be less than $500. And there was a cap set at $1,500. That is Eastern Caribbean dollars. A cap set at that. So if you're contributing or your insurable earnings, your monthly salary that you were insured on was more than $3,000, it would have been capped at 50% of that, of $3,000. And that was subject to any financial assistance you'd have been receiving from your employer. So that would have been deducted from the amount you'd have been entitled to if you received any, and the difference would have been paid out during the period of making the claim. And it's important that the claim had to have been made during the period. So anybody who would have needed to qualify, they had to have made the application between April and September. I'll speak a little bit on what went into the development and implementation of that program. Okay, so again, because we were implementing this program in a COVID-19 environment where social distancing had to be adhered to, businesses were closed, so even trying to receive the information from the employers to validate continued need for the confidentiality of the information on our database and so on. The system had to be developed with the necessary controls to ensure the safety and security of our employees who were coming out to implement that, continue to develop it, our beneficiaries to ensure the payments receive them in a safe manner, receive the application safely and so on, and to ensure that there was no unauthorized deduction from the fund in the sense of fraud and so on as a result of that program. The design and development of that program had to be very specific with the relative controls put in place. So the program started with the design and development of an e-form. Lydia, you can move to the next slide, please. An electronic form to allow our contributors to submit their forms electronically. We were also aware that not everybody may have had access to online to submit those e-forms. We collaborated with the government to utilize the ICT centers around the island so persons had access to that facility if they could not on their own. The forms that were developed were one that could have worked on smartphones, tablets, whatever means to send it through to us. I spoke about the employers portal that had to be developed to accept information from employers online to aid the validation process. Because I mentioned that the payout was a factor of one's contribution, we had to link the application with our database to be able to determine what one would have been entitled to. So design and implementation went into that as well. The controls to prevent fraud, so we had the necessary validation controls put in place with the application. Applicants had to send a copy of the ID so we know we were paying the intended person. We matched NI numbers to our system, collaborated the information with that from the employers, and a whole host of validation processes implemented electronically to ensure that we minimize the amount of time from receipt of application to payout. Went into that. We had to upgrade our web and internal IT system to accept the significant amount of data that was coming into us, which was outside of what we were used to. Again, we facilitated payments directly to the bank accounts of individuals, and most persons had bank account information, and the form was structured in such a way that they provided us with that, and we wanted to ensure we were paying the intended person as well. Persons who did not have bank accounts, we also made special provision with one of our indigenous banks to facilitate the opening of accounts with a slightly reduced requirement to facilitate the ease of opening accounts at that point. The notification system to let persons know the status of their implementation, or sorry, the status of the application also had to be put in place, or the payment process. We had to reallocate staff to other duties to facilitate that. It was new to us. It was not something that we were used to, and we had to do that while continuing to maintain our existing payment of benefits. We reoriented operations, made things more digital, to reduce the person-to-person and physical document process. So quite a bit went into the development of that program to see the payout. I'll pass you over to my colleague to speak on the actual payments that was realized out of the program.
Thank you, Suan. So now we'll look at the information that were derived from the payment of the ER, the number of persons who benefited, and the level of expenditure of these payouts. In this slide, we're looking at the number of active insured who were affected by the current pandemic and who got payout from the NIC. And we saw a total of 16,756 persons actually benefited from the economic relief program. 58% of persons who received the economic relief were between the ages of 16 to 39. Pretty much, oh, sorry. My slide is, I'm actually not.
Lilia is managing the slides.
No,
Do you want me to stop sharing and you could share directly?
No, actually, I'm having a problem with the video itself.
We're hearing you clearly.
But I'm not seeing the slides.
Oh.
In the interest of time, if Callie wants me to go through it, I can. While
Okay,
she tries
now
to
I
sort
can.
it out.
Okay. Okay, just hold on. I will just go through it. All right. So I was saying that 16,756 persons benefited. And of these, 58% of persons who received the economic relief were between the ages of 16 to 39. 51% were females and 49% were male. Then we move on to the other slide. The highlight of this slide is the impact of COVID on the hotel and restaurant sector. Of the 16,756 active insured who were impacted by COVID-19, 49% of these persons were from this sector. So you can see the level of vulnerability of this sector. You can see in order of magnitude, the wholesale retail sector, the transport, storage, communication sector were the other sectors that were hard hit by the current pandemic. Then we move on to the other slide, which gives information on the level of expenditure. And again, the active insured persons who received the economic relief between the ages of 16 to 39 accounted for approximately 58% of total expenditure. Total expenditure amounted to $66.57 million. So it actually costed us quite a bit, but below what was budgeted. If we move on to the other slide, which shows the level of expenditure by economic sector and gender, It shows again that the hotel and restaurant sector accounted for 60% of the economic relief total expenditure, again showing the level of vulnerability of this sector to shocks such as natural disaster and like the current pandemic. If we move on to the other one, the other slide, it shows the trend of active insured persons prior to COVID-19 and during and after. And we're seeing that between April 2020 to March 2021, we had a huge dip. That was the impact, the actual impact of COVID on the active insured population, but we see a gradual rebound. So the number of active insured is growing moderately, and we're hoping that by ending of this year, it would have gone back to its previous trend. Then we move on to the impact on the fund. Active insured person declined by approximately 20% from 53,133 in October to December to 42,593 in April to June 2020. Contribution income contracted by 39.72% from 34.5 million in October to December 2019 to 20.8 million in April to June 2020. As indicated before, 16,756 active insured persons benefited from the economic relief program at a cost of approximately $66.57 million. The long-term impact of the economic relief program on the National Insurance Fund is the earlier depletion by approximately 6 months from June 2015 to December 2050. So the actual impact on the fund of the $66.57 million was actually earlier depletion of the fund by approximately 6 months. And I think the rest of the slide will be continued by my colleague.
Thanks, Gali. So very high level overview on the income support program implemented by the government. So the NIC's program was sought to benefit our contributors. The self-employed currently, it is not mandatory that they contribute to the fund. The government's program sought to capture the self-employed. It was a focus on self-employed persons who may not have been contributors to the fund. And that was to provide income support to them. Their program was a little bit more straightforward in the sense that it was a $500 per month for the period April to June, again, with their program put in place. NIC's role in there was specific. One, to ensure that there was no double dipping in the sense that we did have some self-employed registered with us. So there was a need to ensure that persons were not benefiting from both programs. So our role was to, one, ensure that persons were not already in receipt of ours before the government paid theirs. And the second, applicants, self-employed who employed persons who technically should have been contributing to the fund, the government's program, we needed to confirm that those persons were actually registered with us before they could benefit from the government's program. One of their criteria, a disclaimer within the government's program, was that those self-employed persons who benefited from the program is expected to register and contribute to the NIC when things get back to normal and then they return to the regular operations. Some of the lessons that we have learned from that program, then you can move on to the next slide, was the value of timely and effective communication. Communication of the program, it was new to everybody, how it worked, how it functioned, the status of applications. That was one of the areas where we realized was so significant to ensure the successful implementation of the program and that persons bought on to the value of such an employment benefit. the cost of not being insured came out because persons who could not benefit because whether they were not contributors to NIC or they were not keeping to their submissions came out. The value of automating services for the safety, efficiency, and security of implementation was not underpinned. And ultimately the need for an unemployment benefit. With the lessons coming out of that. I'll have my colleague wrap up with an overview on the outlook going forward.
Hi, Paul, can you hear us? Yes. Okay.
All right, yeah. So arising out of COVID-19 and grappling with low herd immunity, there are important considerations for us as an institution to look at going forward. And one is continued improvement in the provision of social protection to workers. And out of this, we have consideration for implementation of unemployment insurance to formal sector employees in the first instance. Then we have to consider greater collaboration with key government agencies such as the Labor Department, the Central Fiscal Office, Inland Revenue, and the Electoral Department. And then we have to look at the increased level of coverage of self-employed persons. Going forward, we have to start looking at these issues. I want to thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul and Suan. And I know from the point of view of the joint program, we're looking forward to formalize unemployment insurance as it relates to strengthening shock responsive social protection. So we're going to go straight into Barbados's presentation, and Barbados is one of only 2 countries in the Eastern Caribbean, as you heard in the first presentation, that has formal unemployment insurance facilities. So we would be happy to hear from Barbados, and I invite Derek Lowe to give his presentation.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just about to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, but if you can put it into presentation mode.
Do that shortly. Is that fine?
Yes, perfect.
Good. So good morning once again to everybody. I'm happy to be here to be sharing the Barbados experience with you all. And during the next 15 to 20 minutes or so, here's what we will be discussing, or what I will be presenting to you. We'll take a look at the establishment of our legislation, look at our history and background. We will see how the unemployment account is funded. We'll look at some qualifying conditions and requirements. We'll also take a look at the challenges that we experienced during the pandemic, the responses to the pandemic, and then some implications for the future. So right off the bat, the legislation was established rather in 1967. It's called the National Insurance and Social Security Act, CAP 47. And it says there, as you see, to provide a system of national insurance and social security benefits for Barbados. Now, this year we celebrate 54 years of coverage. As you see, we have a wide range of benefits, short-term benefits and long-term benefits. Of course, you can see there's sickness, employment injury, maternity benefits, and there's also long-term benefits. Because of course, today we will be concentrating on the unemployment benefit. Now, the unemployment benefit was established in 1981 as a branch of the Social Security scheme, and its objective to provide financial compensation to employees who, either because of total employment layoff or short time, suffered partial loss of earnings. Employed persons between the ages of 16 and pensionable age is currently 67, are provided with coverage. And coverage refers to permanent government employees, and self-employed persons are not eligible for unemployment benefits simply because they do not contribute to the fund. Let's look at how the fund is financed. And there you see I have a table on the contribution rates. And if you look at the comparison there, you see permanent government employees, and you see there are various categories of which the employees and the employees pay toward. And you'll notice for permanent government employees, unemployment, there's no payment, or government employees do not pay toward unemployment category. But if you're temporary, of course, you pay toward it. And you see the other categories that help to fund it. You see there for non-contributory pensions, the training levy, catastrophe fund, and a health service contribution. And just to give you some comparison in the private sector, similarly, you see there is a 0.75% there for the employee, and similarly for the employer. As it relates to the private sector or statutory board employees. Further comparison for self-employed persons, you'll see straight there is no reference, or in fact, there is no payment toward unemployment simply because those persons do not contribute to the fund. So the unemployment benefit is paid to someone who has become unemployed because they have had an interruption of earnings, as I said before, just to recap for you, or that person may have been kept on short time earnings, and that earnings must be reduced by more than 50% in order to receive the benefit. The employee must be over 16 and under pensionable age. They must be insured for at least 52 weeks, must have at least 7 contributions paid or credited in the relevant quarter, and have at least 20 contributions paid or credited in the 3 quarters ending with the relevant quarter. Can be a little bit much. I think Ariel mentioned some of it before, but just to specify for you exactly what happens as it relates to the qualifying conditions. It is payable for a maximum of 26 weeks in a continuous period, also an aggregate of 26 weeks in the 52 weeks immediately preceding the beginning of that current week of unemployment. So what really happens is if an employee has exhausted all 26 weeks, that individual or claimant must wait for another 52 weeks from the last date of payment on the previous from the previous unemployment benefit claim when that time may have passed. So it's a maximum of 26 weeks in a continuous period for those persons receiving unemployment. Of course, there are cases where persons are disqualified for the unemployment benefit, and you have cases where the person loses their job because of their own misconduct, and we have the right to disallow that person for up to 6 weeks. There are other cases where the person may resign from the job without good cause. They refuse or fail to apply for suitable employment, or they do not avail themselves the opportunity for suitable employment. There are other cases where the person might be out of the island. Of course, there's an exception where they may be representing Barbados at a regional or international event. If there is a late submission more than 2 weeks after the date of termination, the person may be receiving another pension from an employer, or if the person is in prison. So there are quite a few conditions that will disqualify persons from receiving the unemployment benefit. Now, the calculation of the benefit I have to stress here, it is 60% of the average insurable earnings in the relevant quarter. I'll tell you what the relevant quarter is in a minute. And it's divided by 6. I believe Ariel mentioned it earlier in his presentation as well. The relevant quarter is usually the calendar quarter. It goes back 2 quarters from the one in which the benefit is payable. Let me read that again. The relevant quarter is usually the calendar quarter, going back 2 quarters from the one in which the benefit is payable. So here's what it would be. You would have, let's say, the benefit received in October, November, December, and then the quarter which falls 2 quarters prior to that quarter in which the benefit is then payable. Insurable earnings. These are earnings on which contributions must be deducted and paid are referred to as insurable earnings. So you see for the minimum weekly, you pay up to $21 a week and maximum $1,120. And you see the comparison for 2019 and 2020. So persons pay monthly on a maximum of $4,880, $91 minimum monthly. Let's look at the employer requirements now for unemployment. Now, the employer has to provide, once that person is terminated, the employer has to provide the employee with a termination of services or layoff certificate. We call it also the green form or the U3. They must submit a copy of that termination certificate to our email address, which is customer.service, as you see there, within 2 weeks. Now, if that employee is not re-employed on the expected date of reemployment, then the employer must give the employee another termination certificate with a new expected date of reemployment. Now, there's also the case where the employee is reemployed and the employer must complete the declaration form or reemployment of employees form. So what happens is that there are the employer requirements that employer must give the employee a copy of the termination certificate, and they must also submit it to the National Insurance Department. For the employee now, that employee must also submit his or her application within 2 weeks of becoming unemployed. Whether or not, and this is critical, whether or not the claimant has received a termination or layoff certificate, they should still make the application to National Insurance because we use a reference date, in fact, when the application is submitted in order to make the calculation and the process accurate. In terms of the employee application now, we had to obviously refine our process during COVID. So we asked the employee, in fact, let me give you a sense of what happened in the traditional sense. The employee would be terminated and they would come to National Insurance, to our unemployment section, submit the form, the termination form, and they register. Now within 3 weeks of that registration, they had to come back to the office and declare whether or not they remain unemployed or whether they had gone back to work. So what we did now post that traditional thing would be we looked at, we had to refine the application process. So now here's what the employee had to do or has to do. To print and complete and sign the form, the unemployment benefits form, and that is found on our website. You can submit a scanned image of that application form to a specific email address. We had to be able to separate what came into customer service address versus what came into the employee, the other address, that we could make a distinction between the two and make sure that we could match them when we needed to. Because as you recall, as I said before, the employer has to submit the employment determination form and the employee has to also submit one. So there you see, they have to also submit the digital declaration, and persons will go online And every 3 weeks after, they will submit that declaration form. There are cases where now, once we've opened back up, people will come into the office. Of course, we were very careful with our protocols, and that's why we moved the technology fairly far forward in the sense where we ask people to submit their forms online and also make their declarations on their status of unemployment or employment online as well. All right, so let me give you a sense of what happened during the pandemic. Look at some of the stats. If you look at the stats there, you'll see from January to December of 2019, we had about just over 11,369 unemployment claims. And look at the comparison for January to December of 2020. Those claims rose to about 52,282. To give you an update now of what has happened from January to April of this year, you see the number is at about 20,260. And you see the the kinds of monies, the comparison of the kinds of monies that we paid out. So just to jump straight to January to December of 2020, that was $155 million that the National Insurance Department paid with respect to unemployment claims. I'll drill down a little bit further for you and show you the stats as it related to each month. And you can see where the spikes are. Generally, though, I should say that we would receive on average about 11,000 claims, that's pre-COVID. And as you see there in 2019, our total, as I said before, was just over 11,000 claims. And look at the spikes as related to March of 2020, April of 2020 as well. And then you see what the May was another 5,000. And then it brought us down right through the year until a total of 52,000, just over 52,000 claims. And then for 2021, you see what the trend has been like so far. In February, we received 11,802 claims, and it started to reduce as we have been going along this year. Now, some of the other challenges that we faced during this pandemic, of course, there were unprecedented high volume of claims and received in such a short time period. Imagine that, 11,000 on average, then versus 52,000. You had very, very high expectations of a public. Of course, many of them did not qualify and were not eligible for unemployment benefits. So you can imagine the number of calls. We were inundated with calls and emails and even visits to the department, trying really hard to observe the necessary protocols. The processing delays caused by errors, data gaps, and delayed or non-submission of earnings by employers. So as I had mentioned to you earlier, of course, we have to be sure that the earnings are in the relevant quarter so that persons can, or claimants can, receive their unemployment benefit. So there were many cases where there were data gaps or employers did not submit the earnings required that would allow for payment of the benefit. We also had several other situations where there were incorrect employee addresses on the termination certificates. So we could not contact those persons. There were a number of persons who had contributed, who had not contributed, but wished to be paid. You also had several self-employed persons who wished to be paid benefits for which they had never contributed and which, as I mentioned, are not applicable to self-employed persons simply because they do not contribute to that fund. And then there's that significant expenditure increases, the increases of expenditure in the face of declining revenue. Some of the other challenges that we face We recognize the need to hire and train more staff due to the need for more trained claims processors during the period of high volume. It was difficult to reach some employees and employers during the period of closure, obviously then delaying the benefit. There was that issue of widespread email contact. We didn't have a lot of email addresses because persons did not provide us with those details. There are many cases where employees did not have access to the internet, so they asked their employers to submit the benefits, the claim forms rather, on their behalf. And also we had several applications from persons who just simply did not meet the qualifying criteria. But here's how we responded. We recognized that communication is indeed critical. So we had to run quite a few ads explaining to persons the process. We had to make sure that people were, that we all spoke from one sheet and just generally to be on the same page. So what we did was we developed an advance payment system to allow for persons to be paid in a shorter time frame than usual, because obviously there are several persons unemployed and they are just calling the department minutely as to when they will receive their funds. So you could imagine what kind of situation we were faced with during that time. And reducing the number of persons visiting the office by using online methods where persons would submit the forms online, and we allowed where people were not able to have access, let's say they didn't have full access, we allowed them to take a photo of with their phones and have somebody submit it. So we accepted an image via your cell phone. In many cases, though, the images were not the best, but we were able to use them to effect the claim. So we definitely had to put the technology in place, and we continue to use it to make sure that we can process claims in a timely manner. With respect to the payment, in fact, the challenges with the unemployment fund, of course, we had to access a loan rather from the National Insurance Fund to assist with payment of unemployment claims. As you saw earlier, there were 155 million paid in that year, 2020. A look to the future, we are in ongoing discussions in terms of refining our online process to make it easier for claimants to apply for unemployment and easier for staff to process as well. Because you have a system, you have to still ensure that it is easy for staff to do once you're inundated with so many queries and so many claims. Our fund is being recapitalized, which means that government will repay the NAS. And finally, we know that sustaining this fund depends on the recovery of the economy. So there you have it from me, the look at the experience from Barbados. And we will continue to try to make the process easier for those who are applying for unemployment through the technology and making sure that we can pay them in a timely manner. Over to you, Lilia.
Thank you very much for that very detailed presentation. If you can stop sharing. Yes, we have a few minutes for some question and answer. And Derek, I'm going to ask you the first question because it's related to something you said earlier in your presentation. The question is, what about persons who may have an ongoing matter for adjudication at an employment tribunal?
Right, so that's a good question, Lilia. We have once a person has an issue or has been disqualified for one reason or another, they have that right to appeal. So all of our communication, we have a note which informs you that you have the right to appeal within 21 days of submission. So once the you have that 21 days, and it's an excuse me, is an independent tribunal where the matters are heard, and the chairpersons largely drawn from attorneys. They will hear the cases and will make a ruling based on the legislation and so forth.
Okay, thank you. I hope that answers the question, and if there are any clarifications, please put it, just to remind you that if you put your questions in the Q&A box, that would be preferred to the chat. We have a question here from Diana Douglas. The question is, has the distribution of such a large amount of unemployment benefits impacted any other benefits, for instance, pension? From the NIC from St. Lucia, I will invite Suan if she'd like to comment on that, please.
Thanks, Lilia. Good question as well. No, on the ERP program that we developed, it did not impact the future payouts of one. So the entitlements would remain the same. It did not deplete the amount that one would be entitled to. However, during the period of the payment of the ERP, as in from April to September, any other benefit payment that one would have been entitled to at that point, the individual would be entitled to the higher of the two. That was just during that period. But as it relates to future payout of the fund, no, the ERP did not affect that.
Okay, thank you very much. Does any other panelists want to come in? Paul? No? Yes? Okay. Right. I don't see any other questions for our, I don't see any other questions for our panelists. So, one just popped in. Yes, Diana is also interested in hearing about Barbados's experience with dispensing unemployment benefits due to COVID-19. How did that affect? Does it affect unemployment benefits, other benefits, for instance, pension? That's for you, Derek.
Thank you, Lydia. So of course, we continue to pay our range of benefits. It would have affected it simply because of the number of claims that we received. And as I mentioned in my presentation, we continue to pay all our benefits as best as we can, but it would have impacted because we had most hands on deck, because the large number of queries would have come from for unemployment. So yes, we did pay a lot of attention to the unemployment benefit because those were the persons in dire need, but we had various teams that would continue to process rather, the benefits in the other areas of pension, sickness, maternity, and so forth. Hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you. We have lots more questions for Barbados. Considering the high payouts in 2020 and of course 2021, is the NIS prepared for a future shock, maybe like not necessarily COVID-19, but future shock? How prepared are you?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, now we have to have further discussions as to how we will meet those or address those issues if we are faced with any kind of other disaster or a pandemic or whatever kind of disaster. But the discussions are ongoing, and generally speaking, we will now have to look and see how we will be able to refine our processes. The end of my presentation, you see that I mentioned that the sustainability largely is about the recovery of the economy and assisting in that area. And then to you know that this is a contributory scheme, so there's a reduction in the level of contributions. So this is something that we are in discussions, and at some point we'll be able to say more about that.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think we're coming to really the end of this webinar, and perhaps I will invite the panelists to wrap up. Derek, since you have the floor, maybe you could just give your final thoughts and we will move on to the other panelists.
Thank you, Lydia. I just wanted to say it was a pleasure to be able to provide information as it relates to the Barbados experience. Of course, you can feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, further questions, any opinions on anything. We'll be here, and you can get the contact information, of course, from Lilia. And good day to everyone.
Right. Suad?
Thanks, Lydia, and thank you again for that opportunity. In summary, I would say that this pandemic really brought to the fore the value of a well-structured unemployment protection benefit, but importantly, one that does not compromise the sustainability of a fund. We were able to, in a relatively short time, under immense time pressure, design and develop this ERP program, which realized great benefit for the nation. But looking forward, with the benefit of more time and expertise and information, we're looking to see the development of an even better product that would benefit us all. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, would you like to have some final words?
Yes, thanks. Again, given the past experience we have had with the economic relief program, it certainly brought to the fore the importance of being prepared to provide some level of sustainability to the fund. And it shows that going forward, an unemployment insurance program is certainly key for institutions like ours and others who have not formally introduced that unemployment insurance program. And we hope that in the not too distant future, that it would be one of the products which would be added to the benefit branch of Social Security, so that we can provide greater social protection to our insured persons. So also I want to thank the ILO for providing that opportunity for us to provide information on our experience with COVID-19, and hope to continue our collaboration going forward. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Finally, we will have Ariel.
Thank you, Lilian. Thank you, the colleagues from Barbados and St. Lucia. I think two great presentations, which only highlight how important this branch of Social Security is relevant, not only in normal times, but particularly in periods of shocks. And as Lilia said, in building shock responsive, resilient social security and social protection schemes, so this branch cannot be ignored. And this created a lot of interest in many countries in the Caribbean, and at least 6 countries now are really engaged on that. The British Virgin Islands and Grenada, 2 of them. And from the ILO, we are supporting St. Lucia together with the Caribbean Development Bank. And we are also supporting Dominica, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago in the design of the unemployment insurance scheme. It is important that this is done in a framework of dialogue, discussions with the social partners, because financing certainly comes from workers and the employers, and there should be agreements on that. And of course, someone will have to pay for that, and this is where the discussion will become a bit more difficult. So I encourage everyone to have more social dialogue and internal discussions in how better shape the unemployment insurance at the national level, and therefore be a critical component of what we said at the very beginning, universal social protection that is comprehensive, adequate, sustainable, and resilient over time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ariel. So we've come to the end of our webinar this morning. I want to express appreciation to all our panelists for being here today, and also to the ILO Caribbean office facilitating this webinar. I wish you a good rest of the day. Thank you.